How Seretse Khama set Botswana on the right path. From a prince in exile to the first president of his country and a knight of the Order of the British Empire. Through his sheer force of will, he transformed his country into one of the most prosperous in the continent. Seretse Khama was a man who beat the odds for his people and left a legacy of peace and transparency in Botswana that remains to this day. So it is quite surprising that he is not as famous as other founding fathers. Welcome to another installment of Africa's Founding Fathers. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this and turn the notification bell so you don't miss future uploads. To despise ourselves and our ways of life? We were made to believe that we had no past to speak of, no history to boast of. Only the present mattered, and we had very little control over it. A nation without a past is a lost nation, and a people without a past is a people without a soul. It should now be our intention to retrieve what we can of our past. We should write our own history books to prove that we did have a past. And it was a past that was just as worth writing and learning about as any other. These are the words of Seretse Khama. During his life and tenure as president, Khama worked to transform Botswana from one of the poorest countries in Africa to one of the richest because he believed that Africa had once been prosperous and it could go back to being prosperous again after being pillaged by colonialism. His was an uphill battle to show that an African nation could beat the odds and become peaceful and rich. Seretse Khama was born on 1st July 1921 to Queen Tebogo Kebailele and Seretse Khama. His grandfather, Khama III, was Kgosi, meaning King of the Bamangwatu people of Bechuanaland, then a British protectorate. He was named Seretse, meaning clay that binds, because his father and grandfather had reconciled from a fight just before his birth. His grandfather died in 1923, and his father became Kgosi before passing away 2 years later. And so in 1925, at the age of 4, Seretse became king of the Bamangwatu. His uncle Seretse Khama was made regent to rule on his behalf. Khama III, joined by Batoweng I and Sibili I, who were made chiefs of neighboring tribes, traveled to Britain to lobby the Queen for protection from Cecil Rhodes in the north and the Boers in the south. The three chiefs traveled to England in 1895 and spoke all over England, but still the British government delayed in granting their wishes. It was Cecil Rhodes himself who made sure Bechuanaland would never be part of his company's territory. In 1896, under Cecil's direction, 500 British South Africa Company police launched the Jameson Raid against the Boer Transvaal Republic. This raid would lead to the Second Boer War and destroyed Cecil's reputation in Britain. The UK then held off transferring Bechuanaland to Rhodes. And so, throughout the colonial period, because of the lack of minerals or farming land in the region, traditional institutions like the Kgosi were left intact, and the British ruled mainly indirectly through tribal kings turned paramount chiefs. These chiefs traditionally ruled at the people's will, and the meetings were held to discuss matters that affected the tribe. Sometimes the rule of the people could supersede the Khosi's will. It was in this environment that Seretse was expected to rule. However, his ascent to power as Kgosi would not be easy, and this was because of the woman that he chose to marry. In 1947, while studying in England, Seretse met Ruth Williams, an insurance clerk. The two got married in England a year later. The news of the marriage angered his people, who felt that their future king should have married a native Botswana woman who would understand his role as Kgosi. His uncle Tegedi, acting as regent, demanded his return to Bechuanaland so that he could explain himself to his people. Seretse returned, and he held a series of public meetings with the elders of his community. After listening to him, his charisma won them over, and the elders reaffirmed him as Kgosi. Ruth also met the people and was recognized by the community as his wife. After Seretse was recognized as Kgosi, his uncle went into voluntary exile with the Bakwena tribe, and Seretse, now Kgosi, returned to London to complete his studies. However, the Union of South Africa, which had recently instituted apartheid laws, wasn't very happy with a tribal king marrying a white woman. The Union had made miscegenation illegal in their country. Miscegenation was defined as sexual relations between people of different races. They did not like what the interracial marriage represented in the region, a region surrounded by increasingly racist regimes. Rhodesia to the north was also becoming very racially segregated, and the two were not willing to allow a black man married to a white woman become king in their backyard. And so, the Union of South Africa petitioned the British government to prevent this from happening. Britain needed the cheap gold they imported from South Africa, and so they exiled him in 1951, essentially preventing him from going back to his home. The Bamangwatu remained loyal, and when asked by the British to appoint a replacement as Kgosi, they refused. After 5 years in exile, Britain decided to distance itself from apartheid South Africa and allowed Seretse and Ruth back into Bechuanaland. A condition was that they were only allowed back into the protectorate as normal citizens. By now, many natives felt that because of his long absence from home, Western education, and white spouse, he was out of touch with current affairs. Because of this, he was not very popular among the locals. Seretse would not give up, and in 1961, he founded the Bechuanaland Democratic Party. His exile had proved that he was a man who could stand his ground against South Africa and the British, and his party began to grow in popularity. His party dominated the 1965 elections, and he became Prime Minister. In his position as PM, he kept pushing for the independence of Botswana. On 30th September 1966, Bechuanaland gained its independence and was renamed Botswana. The British did not really put up a fight to hold on to the very poor protectorate. And so, the son of the Kgosi ascended to his seat, not of king of the Bamangwatu, but president of his country. A few years before this, Queen Elizabeth had made Seretse a Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire, hence the name Seretse Khama. When Botswana gained independence, it was one of the world's poorest countries. Its revenue came mainly from cattle farming, and it only had 12 kilometers of road. Most of its people did not have access to formal education, with only 100 high school graduates and 22 university graduates. His was not going to be an easy job of getting his people out of poverty. To add to this, he was also surrounded by white-controlled and often racist governments like South Africa and Rhodesia. Apartheid South Africa had even banned him from setting foot in the country after his marriage to Ruth. But unlike many African founders, Seretse had seen democracy in the African context. His father and grandfather had ruled as Kgosi while consulting the Council of Elders and the people at public meetings. His grandfather was dubbed Khama the Good because his leadership was never self-serving. Khama III had built missionary schools and churches to help his people. This was the example that Seretse now followed. So how did this man turn Botswana into the fastest growing economy? He had a bit of luck and a lot of willpower on his side. Diamonds were discovered in Botswana in 1967, just a year after independence. Through diamond exports, Botswana would transform its economy into one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Botswana would avoid the resource curse that plagues countries like Congo in Africa. Because it had already gained independence when diamonds were discovered, Botswana could sign mining contracts that benefited its people. Another advantage was Seretse's fairness and transparency. Instead of making himself dictator and enriching only a few of his family, he used all the diamond revenue to improve state services like education, health, and infrastructure. He also refused to allow uneducated people to work in the civil service just to replace British administrators. Instead, he worked to slowly replace them with natives as the population got better access to education. This meant that the Botswana civil service became a technocratic organization where people were employed for merit and not tribal affiliations. Today, Botswana is the least corrupt country in Africa, and its transparency rate even rivals that of some European countries. Most important of all, Seretse reduced tribal differences. When diamonds were discovered in the Bamangwatos territory, he insisted that all the proceeds go to the state, instead of allowing his own tribe to get a share of the proceeds, which might have alienated other tribes. Through its diamonds proceeds, Botswana became the fastest growing economies in the world between the 1967 and 1980. Finally, he allowed for democratic elections, never stifling opposition and allowing for peaceful transition of power. He was easily re-elected thrice in 1969, 1974 and 1979. When he died in his sleep in July 1980, he was succeeded by the then Vice President Kwet Masiri. 28 years after his death, his son Ian Khama would become the fourth president of Botswana.